3 days before my son's retirement party, I stopped by the bakery on Queen Street to pick up the cake I'd ordered. Lemon drizzle, his favorite since he was 7 years old. The woman behind the counter, my neighbor of 22 years, pulled me aside before I could even say hello. She pressed her hand against my arm and leaned close. "Not here," she whispered. "Come to the back. There's something you need to hear." I thought she'd made a mistake with the order. I thought maybe she'd forgotten the decorating, or mixed up the dates. I followed her through the swinging door into the kitchen, past the cooling racks and the smell of warm bread, to the small office at the back where she kept her books. She closed the door behind us. Her face was the wrong color. "They were in here yesterday," she said. "Your son and that woman he's been seeing. They sat right there." She pointed to the 2 chairs across from her desk. "They didn't know I could hear them from the storage room. I'm really glad you're here with me today. Before we go any further, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I always love knowing how far these stories travel, and I want to be clear that some details in this story have been changed to protect privacy, but the heart of it is real, and I hope it gives you something to think about. My name is Yvonne. I'm 63 years old. I live in Guelph, Ontario, in the house my late husband Gerald and I bought in 1991. A 2-story red brick on a quiet street lined with old maples. Gerald died 4 years ago, pancreatic cancer, 6 weeks from diagnosis to the end. We had 31 years together, and he left me a good life. A paid-off house, a modest investment portfolio, and a restaurant. Calloway's on the main street downtown. We opened it in 2001 with a loan and a prayer, and over 23 years it became something. Lunch crowds, regulars who'd been coming since the beginning, a reputation for the kind of food that made people feel like they were eating at someone's kitchen table. After Gerald died, I kept it running. People told me to sell. My accountant suggested I retire. My sister said I was too old to be on my feet 6 days a week. I told all of them the same thing. This place was Gerald's dream before it was mine, and I wasn't going to let it go until I was ready. My son, my son, had worked at the restaurant since he was 16, washing dishes, then waiting tables, then managing weekends. When Gerald died, he stepped up completely. He was 34 then. He knew every supplier, every staff member, every quirk of the old kitchen. He was good at it. I was proud of him. I told him so regularly. 2 years ago, he started seeing someone. She came into the restaurant one afternoon, a friend of a friend, and by the following spring, she was at our Easter table. She was pleasant enough, organized, spoke with a kind of quiet confidence that I later understood was something else entirely. By last autumn, she had moved into his apartment. By January, she had started coming to the restaurant on her days off, sitting in the corner booth with a laptop open, asking questions I didn't realize I should have found strange. "How many tables do you turn on a Saturday? What's your food cost percentage? Have you ever thought about a second location?" The comments started shortly after, gentle at first. My son would say things like, "Mom, you've been doing this a long time. You could take a step back." Or she would mention, in passing, that a friend of hers had a great experience with a company that helped transition family-owned businesses to the next generation. I didn't read it as a plan. I read it as affection, as concern, as the natural conversation you have when someone loves you and doesn't want to watch you exhaust yourself. I was wrong. In the storage room of that bakery, my neighbor told me what she'd heard. My son and his girlfriend had sat across from her desk. She'd been in the back checking an order when they arrived early and let themselves in through the side, not knowing she was there. They kept their voices low, but sound travels in a small kitchen. She heard enough. She heard my son's girlfriend say that the trust documents were ready, that the accounting firm she'd found had confirmed the valuation at just under $800,000, which was lower than they'd hoped, but workable. She heard my son ask about the timeline. She heard her say that the retirement party was the right moment, that I would be relaxed, surrounded by people, and that after the speeches, she would bring the papers over and present them as a gift to Yvonne. So she never has to worry about the restaurant again. A transfer of management authority, she called it. A formality. My son asked if I would need a lawyer present. She said that I wouldn't, because the documents were designed to look like what I'd always talked about, handing the restaurant to my son. That I would think I was signing for that. My neighbor stopped talking. She looked at me across her small desk, and I could see she had been carrying this for a full day and hadn't slept. I thanked her. I picked up the cake. I walked to my car, put the box on the passenger seat, and sat there for a very long time. The restaurant had been assessed at $800,000. That was what she'd said. I'd had it assessed independently in 2022, and it came in at just over $1.2 million, including the building, which Gerald and I had purchased outright in 2015. Whatever firm she'd found had come in low, and the document she described, transfer of management authority, was not the same as signing the restaurant to my son. That was something else. That was something that, depending on how it was written, could transfer far more than management. I didn't cry. I drove home. I put the cake in the refrigerator. I sat at the kitchen table where Gerald and I used to drink our morning coffee, and I looked at his photograph on the counter, and I thought very clearly, I have 3 days. My hands rested flat on the table. The house was quiet. Outside, the street was just beginning to thaw. Early April, the kind of afternoon where the light goes pale gold before 5 o'clock. Gerald would have known exactly what to do. He always said that the most dangerous thing in business wasn't a bad year or a difficult landlord. It was the moment you stopped paying attention because you trusted someone. I had stopped paying attention. I had trusted my son completely. I called my solicitor that evening. Her name is Bridget, and I've used her for 15 years. Wills, the building purchase, a contract dispute in 2018. I told her I needed to see her the following morning, first thing, and that it was not a small matter. She heard something in my voice and didn't ask questions. She said 7:30, her office. I didn't sleep. I went through the filing cabinet in Gerald's old study, the one I'd barely touched since he died, and pulled out every document I could find. The original restaurant incorporation papers, the property deed, the last 3 years of financial statements, a copy of my own will, which I'd updated 6 months after Gerald passed. I spread them across the desk and read through them with the same feeling you get when you suddenly realize you've been driving in the wrong direction and you're not sure for how long. The will left the restaurant to my son outright, with the building. That had always been the plan. He knew it. He'd known it for years. Which meant, and this landed slowly like something too heavy to catch, he didn't need to steal it. He was already going to get it. Whatever this document was, whatever she had arranged, it wasn't about love or inheritance or helping me rest. It was about getting it sooner, and without conditions. Bridget's office smelled like old paper and good coffee. She listened to everything without interrupting. When I finished, she set down her pen and looked at me over her reading glasses. The phrase, transfer of management authority, can mean almost anything, she said. Depending on how it's drafted, it can include signing authority on accounts, control of the corporate entity, the ability to refinance or sell assets. If the building is under the restaurant's corporate structure, it could be everything. I asked her if we could stop it. She said yes. But we needed to know exactly what the document said, and we needed to move quickly. She suggested someone who could investigate the financial side. A forensic accountant she'd worked with before, a woman named Loretta Park, who specialized in family business disputes. She also suggested we file a precautionary notice on the property title that week, which would prevent any transfer from going through without my direct written consent and a 7-day waiting period. I asked how much time the filing would take. 2 days, she said. Maybe 1, if we moved that afternoon. We moved that afternoon. I drove home and did something I hadn't done in 4 years. I went into Gerald's study, sat down in his chair, and talked to him out loud. I know how that sounds. I don't apologize for it. I told him what was happening. I told him I was scared. I told him I didn't understand how I'd missed it. And then I stopped asking how and started asking what. What did I need to know? What did I need to prove? That evening, my son called. Cheerful. Easy. Asking whether I'd confirmed the party venue and whether I needed him to pick up anything for the weekend. I said everything was fine. I said I was looking forward to it. I asked, very casually, how things were going at the restaurant. He said great. He said the March numbers had come in strong. He asked if I'd thought any more about taking a real holiday this summer, somewhere warm. We've been talking about it, he said. About how you deserve a break. He said we, as though my future was already a conversation he was having with someone else. I said that sounded lovely. I said goodnight. I sat in the kitchen and wrote down everything I remembered from that phone call, word for word, with the time. The next morning, Loretta Park arrived at the restaurant an hour before we opened. She was small, direct, and carried a briefcase that looked like it had survived a great deal. I gave her the financial statements, the incorporation papers, the property deed. I told her what my neighbor had heard. She asked me 3 questions: whether I had sole signing authority on the business accounts, whether my son had ever been added to the property title, and whether I had ever formally assigned him any corporate role in writing. The answer to all 3 was no. She looked almost relieved. Then what we're dealing with, she said, is a document designed to manufacture what you haven't actually given him. What I need to find is whether there's already been any movement. Any accounts opened in the company's name without your knowledge. Any filings. She found something that afternoon. She called me at 4 o'clock. In February, a numbered company had been registered in Ontario under the name 4731209 Ontario Inc. The registered director was my son. The registered agent was a law firm I'd never heard of, based in Mississauga. The stated business purpose, filed with the provincial registry, was restaurant acquisition and management. February. 2 months ago. While he was still calling me every Sunday, while she was still sitting in the corner booth, asking friendly questions about food cost percentages, I sat with that for a long time. I called Bridget. She said this was serious, and that we should consider bringing in the party, the retirement party, as an opportunity to document everything in front of witnesses. She said it was up to me. She said the alternative was to approach my son privately, confront him, and hope that the conversation resolved it. She paused. But if the document is already prepared and the plan is already in motion, she said, a private conversation gives them time to adjust, to hide things, to claim you misunderstood. I thought about my son's voice on the phone the night before. Easy, cheerful, I said. Let's use the party. The retirement party was held at Calloway's on a Saturday evening. 40 guests, mostly family and longtime staff, and a handful of friends who'd known us since the early years. My sister had driven in from Kingston. My son had handled the arrangements himself, which I now understood differently. He'd wanted control of the room. She was there in a blue dress, helping with name cards. I had asked Brigid to attend as a friend. I had asked Loretta to prepare a brief summary of what she'd found. The numbered company, the registration date, the legal firm. I had asked my neighbor, who had offered without being asked, to write down exactly what she'd heard in her bakery, signed and dated. And I had asked my closest friend of 30 years, who had known Gerald and who had watched my son grow up, to stand near the back and to not leave the room. The evening went smoothly. My son gave a speech about his father and the restaurant, and what it meant to carry something forward. He talked about legacy, about trust, about how much he'd learned watching us build something from nothing. The room was warm and full of people who'd known us for decades, and I watched his face while he spoke and tried to find something I recognized. I found it, just for a moment. When he talked about Gerald, his voice caught. That part, at least, was real. After the speeches, his girlfriend appeared at my elbow with a gentle smile and a folder. "We wanted to do something meaningful tonight," she said. "We put together some paperwork. It's basically just making official what's already been the plan for years. Callum takes over the day-to-day. You stay on as the owner of record. It's just a formality. You'd be able to relax finally." She held the folder out to me. I didn't take it. I looked at my son, who was watching from across the room. And I saw it then, the slight tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes flicked to the folder and back to my face. "I'd like everyone's attention," I said. The room quieted. My son's expression changed. I spoke for about 20 minutes. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't call anyone names. I simply described, in the order it had happened, what I had learned over the past 3 days. I mentioned the conversation my neighbor had overheard, and my neighbor stood up and confirmed it. I mentioned the numbered company, registered in February, and Loretta stood up and read the registration details aloud. I mentioned the document in the folder, which Bridget took from the table where it had been left. Reviewed briefly and described to the room. "This document," Bridget said, "would transfer signing authority over all corporate accounts, the ability to refinance or sell any property held under the corporate structure, and full managerial control, effective immediately upon signing. It is not a formality." My son said nothing. His girlfriend said, "This is a misunderstanding." She said it twice. Then she picked up her bag and walked to the door. One of the staff members, a young woman who'd worked the floor for 6 years and who Gerald had hired when she was 19, stepped aside to let her pass. Then she looked at me, and she looked at my son, and she went back to clearing tables without a word. My son sat down. His face had gone the color of the tablecloths. I let the silence sit. Then I said, "I love you, and I am not signing anything tonight." He didn't come to me then. He sat very still while the guests around him began to speak in low voices, and then, slowly, in the uncomfortable way of people who've witnessed something they hadn't expected, they began to gather their coats. My sister hugged me by the door for a long time without speaking. My closest friend squeezed my hand and whispered, "Gerald would be proud." I wasn't sure about that, but I held on to it anyway. After the room emptied, I sat alone at the table, in the center of the restaurant, our best table, the one by the window that caught the morning light, and looked at the place Gerald and I had built. The photographs on the wall, the chalkboard menu in his handwriting that I'd never been able to bring myself to change, the radiator in the corner that knocked every February no matter how many times we'd had it looked at. My son came and stood in the doorway of the kitchen. He looked like he had when he was 12 and had broken thing and knew I already knew. I didn't make him stand there long. I pulled out the chair across from me and nodded at it. He sat down. "Tell me when it started," I said. He told me. "It started last October, when she suggested that the restaurant, the way things were structured, was vulnerable. That if anything happened to me, probate could tie up the business for months, and that having a cleaner structure would protect him and protect the business. She knew someone at a firm who specialized in this. It would just take some paperwork. It would be simple." He thought it made sense. He thought it was practical. "Did you know what you were signing?" I asked. "When you registered that numbered company, did you know what it was for?" He was quiet for a moment. "I knew it wasn't just estate planning," he said finally. That honesty cost him something. I could see it. I asked him if he understood what would have happened if I'd signed. He said he'd told himself it was basically what was going to happen anyway. That he'd always been going to get the restaurant, that it was just a matter of timing. He said it in the way people say things when they're hoping that if they explain themselves clearly enough, the thing they did will stop being what it is. I told him that was not the same thing, and he knew it. He nodded. He didn't argue. I asked about her. Who she was, what she'd told him, what he actually knew about her before all this began. He knew she'd worked in financial consulting. He knew she had connections to family business transition specialists. He'd never asked what that meant exactly. He'd been in love. He hadn't wanted to look too closely. We sat there for a long time after that in Gerald's restaurant, while the street outside went dark and quiet. I didn't fix it that night. You don't fix something like that in one conversation. What I did was file an official complaint with the Law Society of Ontario regarding the law firm in Mississauga. Bridget handled that. Loretta submitted her findings to a forensic audit firm, and we discovered that the numbered company had not yet been used to move any assets. We had moved quickly enough. The precautionary notice on the property title had done its job. His girlfriend left his apartment by the end of April. He told me she'd already had a short list of other clients, elderly business owners, mostly in the region. The firm she was connected to had done this before. That information went to the Ontario Securities Commission, along with everything Loretta had documented. I don't know what became of that. These things take time, and they don't always end cleanly. What I know is that a notice was issued and an investigation opened. My son resigned from the restaurant in May. He sent me a letter, handwritten, 4 pages, the kind of letter you write when you've been sitting, with something long enough that the words finally come out right. He wrote about his father, about feeling invisible after Gerald died, about believing, somewhere in the back of his mind, that the restaurant was the thing I loved most, and that if he could just have it, officially, completely, he would finally feel like he was enough. He wrote that he understood none of that excused what he'd done. He wasn't asking me to forgive him. He was asking me to know him, the whole of him, including this. I read it 3 times. Then I put it in the drawer where Gerald used to keep letters that mattered. I hired a new general manager in June, a woman in her late 40s who'd spent 12 years running a restaurant group in Hamilton. She walked through Calloway's on her first day with her hands in her jacket pockets, looking at things the way Gerald used to, carefully taking stock, and I thought, yes, this is right. The restaurant stayed open. The regulars kept coming. The chalkboard menu in Gerald's handwriting stayed on the wall. In September, my son called. He was brief. He said he'd started therapy. He said he was sorry, not to ask anything of me, just because it needed to be said again. I thanked him for calling. We stayed on the line for a few minutes without much to say, and then he said, "The oak tree in the backyard. Do you remember when Dad and I planted that?" I said I remembered, he said. "I drove past the house last week. It's getting big." I said it was. There was a long quiet. Then he said goodnight, and I said goodnight, and that was that. He sent a card at Christmas. I sent one back. He's living in Waterloo now, working for a small consulting firm. Starting over in the particular way that people start over when they're in their late 30s. And they've had to look at themselves very honestly. I don't know yet what we become on the other side of this. Some things take longer than a year to know. What I do know is that on a cold Thursday morning in late November, I stood in the kitchen at Calloway's before we opened, with a cup of coffee going cold on the counter, and looked out at the street. The maples were bare. A couple walked past with a dog and a stroller. A man in a red jacket stopped to check his phone. Everything looked ordinary. Everything looked like it had always looked. And I thought about what my neighbor had risked by pulling me into that back office. She didn't have to do that. She could have talked herself out of it, told herself she'd misheard, told herself it wasn't her business, told herself it would probably be fine. Instead, she looked at me across that small desk with that wrong-colored face and told me the truth. I brought her 2 lemon drizzle cakes the following week, made in our own kitchen. She cried a little and told me I was being ridiculous. I told her I was being accurate. Gerald used to say that the people worth keeping in your life are the ones who will tell you what you don't want to hear when it matters. He was right about most things. He was right about that. If you've walked all the way to the end of this story with me, I'd love to know. In the comments, tell me what you would have done. Would you have confronted your son privately or done what I did? Would you have signed those papers if you hadn't known? And if you've ever had someone in your life tell you a truth that saved you from something you didn't see coming, I hope you told them thank you, because sometimes the person who saves you is standing behind a bakery counter on Queen Street, and she smells like cinnamon, and she's terrified to say what she knows, and she says it anyway.